Hi, I'm Lily. Are you afraid of cemeteries? Do you think they're haunted? Come with us to see 04 scary stories about cemeteries. As the sun set over the cemetery, an eerie silence fell over the rows of tombstones. The air was saturated with the smell of damp earth and decaying flowers. A group of teenagers dared each other to spend the night in a cemetery, each trying to prove their bravery to the others. They pitched their tents among the graves and passed around a bottle of whiskey to calm their nerves. As the night wore on, strange things began to happen. Tombstones were knocked over and digging could be heard in the distance. The teenagers dismissed it as the wind and their imaginations. But then they heard a whisper coming from the graves. Each one sounded like a different voice, and they spoke languages that the teenagers didn't understand. The whispers grew louder and more urgent, filling the air with an otherworldly energy. Suddenly a hand shot out of the ground and grabbed one of the growths by the ankle. The others scrambled to their feet and ran for the exit, only to find the gate locked. Trapped within the cemetery walls, the teenagers were forced to face the spirits of the dead. They saw apparitions rise from their graves, their eyes glowing with malevolent intent. The teenagers screamed as the ghosts approached them and pulled them down to the ground. The next morning, the caretaker of the cemetery found abandoned tents and the remains of teenagers. He shook his head and muttered about young fools tempting fate. But as he was leaving, he heard a faint sound from the graves, the sound of laughter. As the fog rolled in, shrouding the graves in a veil of darkness, Rachel found herself lost in the cemetery. The air was filled with the smell of death, and the silence was eerie. Like every year, she came to visit her grandmother's grave, but this time was different. As Rachel walked among the headstones, she noticed that many of them were tilted or broken. The plants around them were wilted and dead. She was shaking, she felt like she was being watched, but the cemetery seemed empty. Suddenly Rachel heard a scratching sound coming from nearby. She turned to see an old hand clawing at the ground. Her heart pounded in her chest as more joined the hand until a group of zombies crawled out of their graves, their eyes blazing with hunger. Rachel tried to escape but was surrounded. They grabbed her and dragged her to the open tomb of her grandmother's grave. Looking down into the darkness, she saw that it was filled with the twisted remains of the other corpses. Rachel shuddered as the zombies approached her. She realized too late that she shouldn't have gone to the cemetery after dark because the grounds were cursed. Rachel has become the latest addition to the ranks of the Walking Dead, forever trapped in the cursed graveyard. As the moon rose high in the sky and the wind howled through the trees, a small group of teenagers decided to sneak into an old abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town. They had heard rumors of strange happenings and unexplained sounds coming from the cemetery walls, but they didn't believe the stories. As they passed rows of ancient tombstones and crumbling mausoleums, they laughed and joked, daring each other to touch the cold, moss-covered stones. But when they reached the center of the cemetery, they suddenly heard a sound that sent chills down their spines. It was the sound of digging, coming from one of the freshly dug graves. The teenagers tried to run, but their legs felt heavy, as if an invisible force held them in place. They turned to see a figure emerging from the open grave, a figure dressed in rotting burial clothes, with skin the color of mold and eyes that glowed like fire. The creature reached out a bony hand, grabbed one of the teenagers, and dragged them back into the depths of the grave. The others heard the sound of bone crunching and flesh tearing as the creature devoured its prey. As they stumbled out of the cemetery screaming in terror, they knew they would never be the same again. They have uncovered dark secrets hidden in an old cemetery, and these secrets will haunt them forever. It was a dark, moonless night when a group of teenagers decided to sneak into a local cemetery. They didn't believe the stories of the spooky ghosts that were said to haunt the grounds, so they foolishly ignored their neighbors' warnings and snuck in anyway. As they passed the rows of tombstones, one of the boys noticed something strange. "Hey, look at this," he exclaimed, pointing to a grave that looked like it had been freshly dug. As they approached, they saw that the earth was still fresh, the clay dark and moist. Suddenly they heard a soft moan coming from deep within the grave. As they watched in horror, the ground began to shift and squirm as if something was trying to climb out. One by one, the teenagers were pulled down into the pit, their screams echoing through the darkness. When the sun rose the next morning, there was no sign of the group except for a handful of torn clothes and scattered belongings. The townspeople shuddered at the thought of what had happened, and since then avoided the cemetery at all costs. But on certain nights, when the wind whispered through the trees and the moon was obscured by dark clouds, an unearthly moan could still be heard from the depths of the earth.